The grey November sky wept over London on the day they buried Lord Richard Tilney, the steady rain seeming to wash away the colours from the world, leaving only the stark black of mourning clothes against the faded landscape. Lady Beatrice Tilney stood motionless beside the freshly dug grave, her pale face a perfect mask of proper grief beneath her heavy black veil, her gloved hands clasped tightly around a single white rose as the vicar spoke words about a man she had scarcely known despite 6 years of marriage. The assembled mourners, the finest of London society, watched her carefully, their eyes assessing her performance of widowhood with the critical gaze of those who thrived on tragedy when it happened to others. She felt nothing as the coffin was lowered into the sodden earth, not relief, not sorrow, merely a peculiar numbness that had settled into her bones from the moment the servants had carried her husband's body into Tilney House after his fatal fall from his horse. The marriage that had begun with such promise when she was barely 19 had gradually transformed into an elegant prison of silence and neglect, with Richard spending his evenings at his club and his affections elsewhere, leaving Beatrice to maintain the illusion of a contented union before the watchful eyes of society. Colonel Frederick Brandon stood beside her, a solid presence in his military uniform, close enough that she could feel the warmth emanating from him, yet maintaining a respectful distance, as befitted his position as her husband's closest friend. He had been the one to bring her the news of Richard's accident, his deep voice gentle as he took her hands in his and spoke the words that would forever change her life. And he had remained by her side through the blur of funeral arrangements and condolence calls that followed. Beatrice was acutely aware of the faint scent of sandalwood that always accompanied him, a comforting constant amid the cloying perfume of funeral flowers and damp earth. Frederick kept his gaze fixed on the coffin, his strong jaw clenched tightly as he battled emotions far more complex than the simple grief expected of him. The guilt that had been his constant companion since realizing his feelings for his friend-wife threatened to overwhelm him as he stood at the graveside. The terrible truth that beneath his genuine sorrow for Richard lay a forbidden hope that made him despise himself even as he could not extinguish it. He had loved Beatrice in silence for 3 years, since the summer house party at Tilney Country Estate, when he had discovered her alone in the library, reading poetry by lamplight while her husband gambled into the early hours with his companions. Their friendship had grown slowly, built on shared literary interests and conversations about art and music that Richard had always dismissed as tedious, and Frederick had guarded his increasing affection with the honor of a military man who would never betray a friend trust. The vicar finished his sermon and gestured for Beatrice to step forward and place her rose upon the coffin. As she moved, her composure nearly faltered, not from grief, but from the sudden, stark realization of her freedom, a thought so improper that she immediately buried it beneath layers of appropriate solemnity. One by one, the mourners followed her example, adding their flowers to the wooden box that contained the earthly remains of Lord Richard Tilney, a man widely respected in society circles for his impeccable lineage and considerable fortune, if not for his character or fidelity. Lady Whitmore approached Beatrice after placing her flower, her voice a practiced whisper of condolence as she pressed her cheek against the new widow. "My dear Lady Tilney, such a tragedy to lose him so young. You must call upon me when you feel able to receive visitors. I remember all too well the loneliness of early widowhood." Beatrice murmured the expected thanks, though she knew Lady Whitmore's interest stemmed more from curiosity than compassion, the older woman already assessing how this death might alter the careful alignments of society. More condolences followed, a procession of black-clad figures speaking gentle platitudes that Beatrice acknowledged with the perfect composure expected of a woman of her station. Through it all, Frederick remained nearby, his presence a silent support that anchored her more effectively than any of the sympathetic words offered by those who had gossiped about her marriage for years. The rain increased as the last of the mourners made their way toward waiting carriages, and Frederick stepped closer to Beatrice, offering his umbrella to shield her from the worsening downpour. As they walked together across the cemetery grounds, the bare trees around them twisted against the leaden sky like arthritic fingers, the fallen leaves plastered to the pathways by the relentless rain. A gust of wind caught Beatrice's veil, momentarily exposing her face to Frederick's watchful gaze, and in that unguarded instant he glimpsed not the devastating grief of a loving wife, but the complex emptiness of a woman who had learned to expect nothing from the man she had married. That glimpse, brief as it was, stirred emotions he had no right to acknowledge, and he quickly looked away, focusing instead on guiding her safely through the maze of gravestones toward her waiting carriage. "I shall call upon you tomorrow, Lady Tilney, to see if there is anything you require," Frederick said as they reached the carriage, his voice carefully controlled to reveal nothing of the thoughts that tormented him. "That is kind of you, Colonel Brandon," Beatrice replied, her voice soft but steady. "The servants informed me that several of my husband's business associates have requested meetings. Perhaps you might advise me on these matters. I would be honored to assist in any way possible," he responded, bowing formally before offering his hand to help her into the carriage. Beatrice's fingers rested in his palm for a moment longer than strictly necessary, and when she raised her eyes to his, something passed between them, unspoken but undeniable. "I will see you safely home, Lady Tilney," he said, his deep voice carrying an undertone of meaning that extended far beyond the simple journey from cemetery to residence. "You always have, Colonel Brandon," she answered, holding his gaze with a directness that would have been considered improper had anyone observed it. As he closed the carriage door and stepped back, Frederick made a silent vow, one that both honored and defied his friendship with Richard. He would wait the full mourning period of 365 days that society demanded of a widow before speaking the words that had lived in his heart for so long. He would be patient, proper, and respectful, counting each day until Beatrice's black garments could be set aside and his feelings might honorably be expressed. The carriage pulled away, carrying Beatrice back to Tilney House and the beginning of her life as a widow, while Frederick remained by the cemetery gates, rain soaking through his uniform as he silently committed himself to the longest year of his life. Inside the carriage, Beatrice removed her veil and looked out at the rain-soaked London streets, experiencing the first stirrings of an emotion that felt dangerously like hope amid the complicated numbness that had enveloped her since Richard's death. She would observe every protocol of mourning, every ritual society demanded of a grieving widow, even as her heart whispered that perhaps, when those 365 days had passed, she might finally discover what it meant to be truly cherished by a man who saw her not as an ornament or a convenience, but as herself. December descended upon London with merciless chill, the rain that had fallen on Richard Tilney's funeral transforming into sleet that lashed against the windows of Tilney House with angry persistence, as if nature itself sought entry into the once grand residence that now stood in growing disrepair. Lady Beatrice Tilney sat alone in her late husband's study, a single candle illuminating the mahogany desk where she had spent the evening sorting through the chaotic remnants of Richard's business affairs, her black mourning gown absorbing the feeble light until she seemed almost to disappear into the shadows. The room still carried traces of his cologne, that distinctive scent of bergamot and cedar that had once announced his presence before he entered a room, now a ghostly reminder of a man who had become a stranger long before his death. Beatrice had dismissed 3 more servants that morning, the elderly housekeeper weeping silently as she accepted her final wages, having served the Tilney family for over 20 years but unable to remain in a household that could no longer afford her services. The discovery had begun innocently enough, with Beatrice attempting to locate the deed to a small property in Kent that she believed might provide some income, but as she systematically worked through the drawers and cabinets of the study, she uncovered instead a catastrophic web of IOUs, promissory notes, and increasingly desperate letters from creditors. Richard, it seemed, had gambled away not only his inheritance, but had secured loans against properties she had believed safely entailed, leaving her with debts that exceeded even her substantial dowry. The candle guttered as she opened yet another drawer, this one locked until she had discovered the key concealed behind a loose panel in the desk, and here lay the final betrayal, more intimate and perhaps more wounding than the financial ruin. Letters, dozens of them, in varying hands but all distinctly feminine, filled the drawer in damning profusion, some dating back to the first year of their marriage, each filled with intimate details that made Beatrice's cheeks burn with humiliation even as her hands grew cold with shock. He had kept them all, these mementos of his infidelities, preserved like trophies while maintaining the fiction of a respectable marriage, escorting Beatrice to society functions with perfect courtesy, before slipping away to visit these other women, some of whom she recognized as acquaintances who had taken tea in this very house, seated across from her with smiles that now revealed themselves as masks for contempt. The sound of the door knocker echoed through the half-empty house, startling Beatrice from her painful reverie, and she heard the shuffling footsteps of Jenkins, the elderly butler she had retained more out of kindness than necessity, making his way to admit the unexpected caller. A deep voice carried up the stairs, achingly familiar in its resonant timbre, and despite her state of distress, Beatrice felt a flicker of warmth at the knowledge that Colonel Frederick Brandon had honoured his promise to check on her welfare. She hurriedly wiped the tears from her cheeks and attempted to gather the scattered evidence of her husband's betrayals. But before she could restore order to the chaos, Frederick appeared at the study door, his tall figure framed in the doorway, as Jenkins announced him with formal precision before retreating to his quarters below stairs. "Colonel Brandon, my lady," the butler intoned before disappearing, leaving them alone in the study where the candle now burned low, creating more shadows than illumination. Frederick entered the room with the quiet confidence that characterized his movements, but halted abruptly when he observed the state of the desk and, more concerningly, the obvious distress evident in Beatrice's normally composed features. "Lady Tilney, forgive the intrusion," he began, then abandoned formality entirely as he registered the scattered papers and the letter clutched in her trembling hand. "Beatrice, what has happened?" The use of her given name, forbidden by the conventions that governed their friendship, broke something in Beatrice's carefully maintained composure, and to her mortification, fresh tears spilled onto her cheeks, impossible to hide or explain away. "My husband, it seems, was not the man I believed him to be," she said, her voice wavering between dignity and despair as she gestured helplessly at the evidence spread before her. Frederick crossed the room in 3 swift strides, taking in the nature of the documents with a practiced eye, his expression darkening as understanding dawned. "I suspected Richard's finances were precarious," he admitted, his jaw tightening as he surveyed the scale of deception laid bare by the papers on the desk, "but I had no idea it had progressed to this extent." Beatrice watched his face as he registered not just the financial records, but the nature of the personal correspondence, and saw something dangerous flash in his eyes, a controlled fury that reminded her that beneath his gentlemanly exterior, Frederick Brandon was a soldier who had faced death on battlefields across Europe. "These letters," he began, then stopped, clearly struggling for words that would not further wound her pride. "I am aware of their contents, Colonel," Beatrice said quietly, drawing herself up with dignity despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "It appears my husband maintained numerous liaisons throughout our marriage, some with women I counted as friends." Frederick's hands clenched at his sides, the only outward sign of the rage coursing through him, fury at his dead friend for the cavalier disregard of the treasure he had been entrusted with, for the pain he had caused this woman who deserved so much more than empty vows and cold betrayal. "He left me nothing but debts and memories I wish to forget," Beatrice continued, her voice growing steadier as she gave words to the anger beginning to eclipse her initial shock. "A life built on deception, and now a name tarnished by scandal once these debts become common knowledge. Then perhaps it is time to create new memories, ones worthy of you." Frederick responded, the words escaping before he could censure them, too revealing of the feelings he had sworn to keep hidden until the appropriate time. When the appropriate time comes, of course, he added hastily, stepping back slightly as if the physical distance might restore the proper boundaries between them. Beatrice looked up at him, truly seeing him for the first time that evening, noting the raindrops that still clung to his greatcoat and the concern etched into his features, and felt a curious lightening of the despair that had engulfed her as she uncovered Richard's betrayals. "You are kind to say so, Colonel Brandon," she replied, her use of his formal title a gentle reminder of the conventions that must govern their interactions during her period of mourning, though her eyes conveyed gratitude that transcended social restrictions. Frederick moved to the fireplace, stoking the dying embers into renewed warmth before returning his attention to the immediate problems revealed by Richard's papers. "We must consult with Mr. Harrington immediately," he said, referring to the solicitor who handled legal matters for several military families, including his own. "There may be ways to protect certain assets from creditors, particularly any properties that formed part of your dowry." Beatrice nodded, grateful for his practical approach that allowed her to set aside, temporarily at least, the more personal betrayals that continued to sting like individual lashes across her heart. As they began to organize the papers into some semblance of order, their hands occasionally brushed, each contact sending a jolt of awareness through Beatrice that she immediately suppressed as inappropriate to her situation. Yet she could not help but notice the contrast between Frederick's steadfast support and Richard's years of deception, between the colonel's respectful attention and her husband's casual disregard. When he finally departed 2 hours later, having helped create a preliminary accounting of her financial situation, Beatrice stood at the window watching his tall figure disappear into the sleeting darkness, a curious mixture of emotions swirling within her as the house settled into silence around her. Across London, in his modest quarters near the military offices, Frederick Brandon removed his damp uniform and methodically prepared for sleep, his movements automatic while his mind remained at Tilney House with its proud, wounded mistress. Before extinguishing his lamp, he paused before the small desk where a carefully annotated calendar lay open, the first 30 days since Richard's funeral already marked with precise crosses. 335 days remaining, he thought, tracing the path of dates that stretched before him like an arduous campaign, each day a battle between honor and desire, between the respect society demanded he show a widow in mourning and the increasingly powerful urge to offer Beatrice everything his heart contained. As he finally sought his bed, Frederick found himself planning strategies to ensure Beatrice's financial security without wounding her pride, constructing arguments to present to creditors who might be persuaded to reduce or defer their claims, considering which of his military connections might assist in finding potential purchasers for properties that might need to be sold. He would help her rebuild from Richard's betrayal, support her through the difficult months ahead, and when the proper time came, he would offer her a love untainted by deception, if she would accept it from a man who had silently loved her even when she belonged to another. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. February gave way to March, and with the first tentative signs of spring emerging from winter's grip, Lady Beatrice Tilney bid farewell to London society and the imposing grandeur of Tilney House, exchanging the watchful eyes and whispered speculations of the ton for the quiet sanctuary of Rose Hill Cottage in Devonshire, where she had spent the golden days of her childhood before her parents' deaths and her subsequent marriage at 19 to Lord Richard Tilney. The small stone cottage, nestled on a rolling hillside overlooking the village of Thornbury, had been part of her mother's dowry and had fortuitously remained in Beatrice's name rather than being transferred to her husband upon their marriage. A legal oversight that now proved to be her salvation, amid the financial devastation Richard had left in his wake. Colonel Frederick Brandon had arranged a 3-week leave from his military duties, citing personal matters that required his attention in Devonshire, though his superior officers exchanged knowing glances at his request, aware that his childhood home lay in the same county where the widowed Lady Tilney was establishing her retreat. He travelled slightly ahead of Beatrice's party, ensuring that the cottage was habitable after years of being maintained only by a caretaker, personally overseeing repairs to the roof and chimney, and discreetly arranging for the delivery of essential provisions that would spare Beatrice the immediate concern of household management upon her arrival. The journey from London took 2 full days, with an overnight stay at a respectable inn, where Beatrice was accompanied by her lady's maid, Martha, the only servant besides the elderly Jenkins, whom she had been able to retain after settling the most pressing of Richard's debts. Frederick rode alongside the carriage, ostensibly as protection on the roads where highwaymen occasionally troubled travellers, though his true motivation lay in the simple pleasure of being near Beatrice, of seeing her gradually shed the stifling formality that London society had demanded of her as she moved further from the city and closer to the place she had once called home. When they finally crested the hill that revealed Rose Hill Cottage in the valley below, Beatrice impulsively ordered the carriage to stop, stepping out to view the scene spread before her like a painting from her childhood memories. The stone cottage with its thatched roof and climbing roses just beginning to bud, smoke curling invitingly from the chimney, and beyond it the patchwork of fields and hedgerows stretching toward the distant shimmer of the sea. "It is exactly as I remember it," she said softly, the first genuine smile Frederick had seen since Richard's death lighting her features as she breathed in the clean country air scented with earth and new growth. "The village seems unchanged as well," she continued, gesturing toward the cluster of buildings around the church spire, "though I shall be quite a curiosity to them, I imagine, a widow returned in reduced circumstances after years in London society." Frederick, standing a respectful distance from her at the roadside, felt hope unfurl in his chest like the first tentative leaves of spring as he observed the lightness that seemed to enter her bearing with each breath of Devonshire air. "You will find the people here have longer memories and kinder hearts than London society, Lady Tilney," he said, his deep voice carrying on the breeze between them. "They will remember you as Margaret Fairfax's daughter before they think of you as Richard Tilney's widow." Beatrice turned to him then, surprise and something warmer flickering across her features at his reference to her mother, a woman who had been beloved in the village for her generosity and gentle spirit. "You remember my mother, Colonel Brandon?" she said, the formality of his title at odds with the softness in her voice. "From my boyhood visits to my uncle's estate," Frederick confirmed, with a smile that transformed his usually serious countenance. "She would bring baskets to the tenants during difficult winters, and once nursed my cousin through scarlet fever when no one else would venture near the sick room. Her kindness was well known in these parts." The remainder of the journey passed in comfortable conversation, with Frederick sharing memories of the county that had been his childhood playground during holidays, and Beatrice gradually revealing more of her own recollections of life before London and the gilded cage her marriage had become. By the time they reached the cottage gate, a curious transformation seemed to have occurred. The rigid social barriers that had governed their interactions in London softened by the Devonshire landscape and the shared connection to this place that had shaped them both in different ways. The cottage interior presented a stark contrast to the opulent rooms of Tilney House, with low ceilings crossed by wooden beams, simple furniture that had belonged to Beatrice's grandparents, and small windows that nonetheless filled the rooms with golden light that danced across whitewashed walls. Yet as Frederick observed Beatrice moving through the space, trailing her fingers over the worn oak table and pausing to admire the view from each window, he recognized that she appeared more at home in these modest surroundings than she ever had amid the grandeur of her London residence. "I shall leave you to settle in, Lady Tilney," Frederick said, after ensuring the fires were lit and her trunks had been carried inside, his adherence to formality a reminder to them both of the necessary boundaries between a widow in mourning and a gentleman with honourable intentions. "I have taken rooms at the Rose and Crown in the village, should you require any assistance during your adjustment to country life." His thoughtfulness in maintaining a proper distance while remaining available should she need him touched Beatrice deeply. The respect he showed for her position, so different from the calculating approaches she had already received from certain gentlemen in London who viewed a wealthy widow, even one in mourning, as fair game for matrimonial pursuit. The first weeks in Devonshire passed in a gentle rhythm of gradual adjustment, with Beatrice discovering the pleasure of simple tasks she had never been permitted to undertake as Lady Tilney, from collecting eggs from the small henhouse behind the cottage to learning the proper way to deadhead the roses that gave the cottage its name. Frederick called upon her every third day, precisely at the hour when afternoon tea might reasonably be offered, their conversations ranging from practical matters of cottage maintenance to discussions of books they had both read, the latter revealing intellectual compatibilities that deepened their connection even as they maintained the formal address that propriety demanded. On a particularly fine day in early April, when the hillside had begun to bloom with primroses and the first tentative bluebells, Beatrice was showing Frederick her plans for expanding the cottage garden when they were interrupted by the arrival of a handsome curricle driven by Sebastian Whitmore, the largest landowner in the county, and a man whose reputation for charm was matched only by his ambition to expand his holdings and his influence. Mr. Whitmore greeted Beatrice with elaborate courtesy, kissing her gloved hand with a lingering touch that bordered on impropriety, while casting an assessing glance at Frederick, clearly attempting to determine the nature of the Colonel's relationship with the widowed Lady Tilney. I could not believe my good fortune when I heard that the cottage was occupied once more, and by none other than the daughter of my dear friends the Fairfaxes, Whitmore declared, his practised charm evident in every syllable as he accepted Beatrice's offer of refreshment in the garden. "London's loss is most certainly Devonshire's gain, Lady Tilney, though I confess I am surprised to find you seeking such rural solitude during a time when companionship would seem most comforting." Beatrice, perceiving immediately the calculating interest beneath his solicitous manner, replied with a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "The cottage holds many happy memories from my childhood, Mr. Whitmore. I find it provides precisely the peace I require after the bustle of London society." As they sat in the small garden, Whitmore continued his subtle campaign of insinuating himself into Beatrice's good graces, offering assistance with estate matters, while making thinly veiled references to the difficulties a woman alone might face in managing even a modest property. His conversation was liberally sprinkled with mentions of his own extensive holdings and connections, each reference clearly intended to impress upon Beatrice the advantages an alliance with him might offer. Frederick observed the exchange, with outward composure, though his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly each time Whitmore leaned too close to Beatrice or allowed his gaze to linger inappropriately upon her figure, which even the severe lines of her black mourning gown could not disguise. "I understand the proprieties of mourning can be rather burdensome, Lady Tilney," Whitmore remarked as he prepared to take his leave after nearly an hour of increasingly transparent overtures. "Society in the countryside is far less rigid than London, and a widow of your youth and beauty need not consign herself to solitude for the full year that tradition dictates, particularly when agreeable companionship is readily available." Beatrice met his presumptuous gaze with cool dignity, her voice pleasant but firm as she replied, "Some things are worth waiting for, Mr. Whitmore," her eyes shifting momentarily to Frederick, who stood a few paces away. The meaningful glance between them communicating volumes that Whitmore, for all his worldly experience, entirely missed. "I intend to observe the proper period of mourning out of respect not merely for tradition, but for my own need to reflect and recover." Whitmore departed shortly thereafter, clearly disappointed but undeterred, promising to call again soon with information about a local assembly that might provide some acceptable entertainment, even for a lady in half-mourning, a state Beatrice would not officially enter for several months yet. As Frederick and Beatrice watched the curricle disappear down the lane, a comfortable silence fell between them, broken finally by Frederick's dry observation that Mr. Whitmore's interest in her welfare seemed remarkably pronounced for such a recent acquaintance. "He has approached 3 widows within my knowledge, each possessing some property that conveniently adjoins his own lands," Beatrice replied with unexpected humor. The first true laugh Frederick had heard from her lips in many months escaping as she added, "I believe my cottage's access to the stream that waters his southern pastures is of far more interest to him than any qualities I might possess as a companion." The easy companionship of that afternoon marked a turning point in their relationship, a subtle shift from the formal interactions of London to something more natural and unguarded, though still bounded by the respectful constraints that Frederick's honor and Beatrice's situation demanded. As April blossomed into May and the hillsides exploded into colorful life, Frederick's leave of absence drew inexorably to its close, the approaching separation looming over their increasingly frequent walks through the countryside surrounding Rose Hill Cottage. On his final evening in Devonshire, they stood together in the cottage garden as twilight softened the landscape, the scent of newly blooming roses surrounding them as Frederick formally took his leave, promising to write when military duties permitted and to return when possible, though both knew that his regiment would soon be engaged in extended training that would make visits impossible for some months. When the moment of farewell could no longer be delayed, Frederick extended his hand in the gesture of polite friendship that was all society would permit between them, but as Beatrice placed her fingers in his palm, neither seemed able to complete the expected brief handshake and release. Instead, their hands remained joined for long seconds that stretched beyond propriety, Beatrice's ungloved fingers warm against his skin, the contact communicating all that could not yet be spoken between them as they reached the halfway point of their unacknowledged vigil. 182 days passed since Richard's funeral, 183 still to come before honor would permit Frederick to speak the words that lived in his heart. Summer unfurled across Devonshire in waves of golden light and verdant growth, transforming the rolling countryside surrounding Rose Hill Cottage into a lush paradise that seemed worlds away from the rigid confines of London society that Beatrice had left behind. The 6th month of her mourning period arrived with the June roses that climbed in fragrant profusion around her cottage door, their blooms coinciding with the first letter from Colonel Frederick Brandon, written in a strong, decisive hand that reflected his military precision, yet contained undertones of warmth that caused Beatrice to read it multiple times before composing her reply. The initial correspondence maintained the formal address that propriety demanded, with Frederick sharing carefully edited accounts of military exercises and camp conditions while inquiring politely about her adjustment to country life. Yet even these restrained communications carried currents of deeper meaning that Beatrice found herself analyzing with increasing attention as the weeks passed. The rhythm of her days took on new purpose with these letters at their center. Her morning walks through the countryside gathering observations she might share. Her afternoons often spent crafting responses that required multiple drafts before she felt satisfied with the balance between proper decorum and the growing desire to reveal more of her true thoughts to the man whose absence she felt with surprising intensity. "My dear Lady Tilney," Frederick wrote in early July, "the summer campaign progresses with the expected tedium of maneuvers that seem designed primarily to exhaust the men and horses in equal measure rather than to improve our tactical capabilities. Colonel Harrison speaks frequently of the autumn inspection by the Duke of Wellington himself, an event that occupies his every waking thought and leads him to demand increasingly elaborate formations that I suspect even the Iron Duke would find excessive. I find myself counting days with unusual attention this year, marking the passing of each week with a precision that my fellow officers have begun to remark upon. Tell them it is merely the soldier's habit of anticipating the end of an assignment, though in truth my attention is fixed not on the conclusion of these exercises, but on a calendar of far greater personal significance. I trust this letter finds you well and taking advantage of what I imagine must be glorious weather in Devonshire. The local physician has recommended sea bathing for Lieutenant Philip's rheumatism, which reminds me of your mention of walks along the coastal path near Thornbury. I hope you continue to find restoration in such excursions and in the tranquility of your cottage life. Your obedient servant, Colonel Frederick Brandon. Beatrice found herself smiling as she read the carefully composed paragraphs, recognizing in his reference to counting days an acknowledgment of their unspoken agreement, the mutual understanding that they were both marking time toward the end of her mourning period with private calendars that could not be mentioned directly, but existed nonetheless as a shared secret between them. Her reply, begun that same evening and posted the following morning, matched his formal structure while allowing small glimpses of her inner world to emerge between the conventional phrases. "Dear Colonel Brandon," she wrote, "Devonshire continues to reveal its charms with each passing week, and I find myself increasingly grateful for the circumstances that led me to return to this place of my childhood, though I regret that it required such painful revelations to prompt this homecoming. The cottage garden flourishes beyond my expectations, the roses particularly abundant this year, according to Mrs. Thatcher from the village, who brings fresh cream each Tuesday and pronounces herself astonished at the changes I have made to the property. Time moves differently now, sometimes crawling, sometimes flying, but always moving toward something rather than away. This sensation of forward momentum rather than mere endurance is new to me, and brings unexpected contentment even amid the restrictions that my situation necessitates. I have discovered an old pastime recently, one my governess encouraged, but my husband found frivolous. The light here in the valley is exceptional for painting, and I find myself spending hours attempting to capture the changing landscapes that surround the cottage. My efforts are amateur at best, but the occupation fills the afternoon hours pleasantly and provides a sense of accomplishment that I had not anticipated. Should your military duties bring you to Devonshire again, I would welcome your candid assessment of these artistic endeavors, as I value your judgment in matters aesthetic as well as practical. Your friend, Lady Beatrice Tilney. What Beatrice did not reveal in this letter was the extent to which her painting had evolved from casual pastime to consuming passion over the preceding weeks. The small back room of the cottage, with its northern light streaming through wide windows, had been transformed into a makeshift studio, with canvases in various stages of completion propped against the walls and the scent of oils and turpentine permeating the air. Martha, her loyal lady's maid, had helped arrange the space and now regularly trudged to the village for supplies, returning with the specific pigments and brushes that Beatrice requested, with increasing knowledge of her needs as an artist. The landscapes that emerged from her brush captured the Devonshire countryside with a sensitivity to light and atmosphere that belied her modest claims of amateurism, each canvas imbued with emotional resonance that transformed simple rural scenes into expressions of her evolving inner state. Most revealing, though not immediately apparent to casual observation, was the recurrence in nearly every composition of a distant male figure, tall and straight-backed, often positioned on a hilltop or at the edge of a wood, his features indistinct, but his stance unmistakably reminiscent of Colonel Brandon's military bearing. In late July, a visitor from London brought unexpected opportunity when Mrs. Eleanor Gardiner, a distant cousin and one of the few society connections Beatrice had maintained, stopped at the cottage during a tour of the West Country. Upon viewing Beatrice's growing collection of paintings, the older woman recognized genuine talent and mentioned her acquaintance with Mr. Thomas Wilton, proprietor of a small but respected gallery in London that specialized in landscapes by contemporary artists. Despite Beatrice's protests that her work was merely a pleasant diversion, Mrs. Gardiner insisted on taking 2 small canvases back to London, promising to show them to Wilton while maintaining discretion regarding their creator. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from Mr. Wilton himself, expressing admiration for what he termed the emotional authenticity and technical promise of the works he had been shown, and offering to display several pieces in his gallery under a pseudonym. If Lady Tilney wished to maintain her privacy while testing the commercial viability of her art. The idea of earning money through her own social efforts, rather than relying solely on the remains of her inheritance after Richard's debts had been settled, appealed strongly to Beatrice's newfound desire for independence. Under the name B. Fairfax, honouring her mother's family, she sent a selection of her finest landscapes to London, experiencing a thrill of accomplishment entirely different from the social triumphs that had previously defined success in her world. In August, Frederick's letters began to reveal more personal reflections as the formality between them gradually yielded to deeper connection despite the physical distance separating them. His descriptions of military life expanded to include childhood memories triggered by countryside resembling Devonshire, books he was reading during evening hours in his tent, and increasingly transparent references to his anticipation of seeing her again. When Mr. Wilton's letter in early September informed Beatrice that 2 of her paintings had sold to a discerning collector known for identifying promising new talents, she found herself reaching for pen and paper to share this triumph with Frederick before any other, the news seeming incomplete until he knew of it. By the 9th month of her mourning period, their correspondence had evolved into a twice-weekly exchange that both anticipated eagerly, their letters growing longer and more revealing with each posting. Frederick wrote of his frustration with superior officers, whose strategies he considered outdated, of his hopes for eventual promotion that would allow him to establish a more permanent home rather than following the regiment from post to post, and of his growing conviction that true happiness lay not in military advancement, but in creating a life filled with purpose and companionship. Beatrice, in turn, shared her rediscovery of herself beyond the roles of daughter and wife that had previously defined her, her growing confidence in her artistic abilities, and her quiet rebellion against certain mourning conventions that seemed designed to isolate rather than comfort those who had lost spouses. Frederick's quarters in the military camp near Portsmouth offered stark contrast to Beatrice's increasingly personalized cottage. His small tent contained only a narrow cot, a folding desk that held his writing materials and the carefully preserved letters from Devonshire, and a trunk containing his spare uniforms and personal effects. The austere surroundings reflected the disciplined exterior he presented to his fellow officers, who noticed his increasing preoccupation but attributed it to professional ambition rather than personal considerations. Only in the privacy of evening hours did Frederick allow himself to reread Beatrice's letters, studying her elegant handwriting for nuances of meaning and calculating repeatedly the days remaining until propriety would permit him to express the feelings that grew stronger despite, or perhaps because of, their separation. When a letter arrived in mid-September with news that genuinely surprised him, Frederick found himself pacing the perimeter of the camp, struggling to contain emotions that threatened his carefully maintained composure. "I have reached the stage where custom permits the adoption of half-mourning," Beatrice had written, "and yesterday exchanged my black gowns for new garments in lavender and grey. The seamstress in the village seemed scandalized by my insistence on simpler styles than those currently fashionable in London, but I find I have lost my taste for elaborate trimmings and restrictive corseting. There is liberation in choosing garments for comfort and practicality rather than display, though I confess the color change alone has lifted my spirits considerably. Black seemed to absorb not only light but emotion as well, while these softer hues better reflect my current state of mind, which increasingly turns toward future possibilities rather than past obligations. This transition, though merely sartorial in nature, feels significant beyond its visible manifestation, a tangible marker of progress through this prescribed period of reflection and restraint. I find myself contemplating the remaining 3 months with complex emotions that I hesitate to commit fully to paper, though I believe you might understand them without explicit articulation." The implications of her words, The suggestion that she too was counting the days toward the end of formal mourning with anticipation rather than dread caused Frederick's heart to race with hope, even as he reminded himself that patience had brought them this far and must sustain them through the remaining quarter of their unspoken vigil. In his reply, composed that same evening by lamplight as rain pattered against his tent, Frederick allowed himself greater openness than in any previous communication. "The news that you have entered half-mourning brings to mind the gradual return of color to the landscape after winter," he wrote, "a process so subtle in its daily progression that one hardly notices until suddenly the world is transformed from monochrome to vibrant life. I imagine lavender suits you admirably, emphasizing the remarkable color of your eyes that I remember so clearly from our walks in the cottage garden. My duties here will conclude by month's end, and I have requested and received permission for a brief leave before the autumn inspections commence. If it would not inconvenience you, I hope to pay my respects at Rosehill Cottage during the first week of October. The military encampment grows increasingly tedious as autumn approaches, the mud and persistent rain making even the simplest maneuvers an exercise in endurance rather than skill. I find my thoughts turning frequently to Devonshire sunshine and the peaceful sanctuary you have created in your cottage, a sharp contrast to the noise and regimentation that surround me here. Only 91 days remain before convention considers your period of mourning complete. I hope you will forgive the impropriety of noting this so directly, but I find arithmetic occupies my mind with increasing frequency as this year progresses. Your friend, always, Frederick." When Beatrice received this letter, she read it in the privacy of her studio, surrounded by new canvases that increasingly featured not just distant figures, but foreground elements that hinted at companionship and connection. Paired chairs on cottage porches, 2 sets of footprints along painted shorelines, compositions that suggested futures rather than documenting present solitude. She pressed the pages briefly to her heart before carefully placing them in the sandalwood box where she preserved all his correspondence, a collection that chronicled not just the passing of time, but the evolution of understanding between two people moving gradually but inexorably toward each other despite the barriers of circumstance and convention. October approached with the promise of Frederick's visit, and Beatrice found herself filling the cottage with subtle preparations, freshening curtains, arranging late-blooming flowers in strategic locations, and completing a special painting that she kept covered when not working on it. A view of the cottage garden in full summer glory with 2 figures seated side by side on the stone bench beneath the ancient oak tree, their faces in profile showing not who they were, but who they might become together when the final days of mourning released them from the constraints of patience into the freedom of possibility. October arrived in Devonshire with tumultuous weather that matched Beatrice's unsettled emotions as she approached the 10-month anniversary of Richard's death, a milestone that signified both progress and the painful remainder of waiting still required before she could openly contemplate a future beyond widowhood. The morning had begun pleasantly enough, with Beatrice working in her studio on a commissioned landscape for Mr. Wilton, who now regularly sold her paintings to collectors intrigued by the mysterious B. Fairfax, whose work conveyed such emotional depth in seemingly simple country scenes. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves through the open window, and she had just added the final touches to a distant figure on a hillside when Martha interrupted with news that a fine carriage had turned onto the cottage lane, bearing a crest that the maid recognized from her years in London service. Beatrice had barely time to remove her paint-stained apron and smooth her lavender day dress before Jenkins announced Lord Nathaniel Morland with a formality that suggested the visitor had intimidated the elderly butler with his aristocratic bearing. Morland entered the cottage parlour with the confident stride of a man accustomed to deference, his fashionable London attire and carefully arranged dark hair presenting a stark contrast to the simple country setting. Though he had attended Richard's funeral and made a brief appearance at Tilney House during the initial period of mourning, Beatrice had never known him well, Richard having maintained minimal contact with his younger cousin despite their shared family name and Morland's position as heir to the entailed Tilney properties. "I trust you will forgive this unannounced intrusion, Lady Tilney," Morland began, his voice carrying the polished accent of education at Eton and Oxford, though his eyes moved critically around the modest parlour, taking in the simple furnishings with barely disguised disdain. "Family duty compels me to ensure the welfare of my cousin's widow, particularly given the extended duration of your rural retreat." Beatrice offered the refreshment that courtesy demanded, maintaining the composed demeanour she had perfected during years in London society, while inwardly questioning the true purpose behind this unexpected visit. Family concern seemed an unlikely motivation for a man who had shown no interest in her well-being during the previous 9 months of widowhood. As Martha served tea in the best china cups that had belonged to Beatrice's mother, clouds gathered on the horizon, the light in the parlour diminishing as the storm approached across the rolling hills visible through the cottage windows. Morland spoke of London society, of political developments and social events that Beatrice had once participated in, but now found curiously distant from her current interests and concerns. Her attention drifted momentarily to the growing storm outside, the first heavy raindrops beginning to patter against the window panes as thunder rumbled in the distance. "I have secured ownership of Tilney House," Morland announced abruptly, setting down his teacup with a decisive click against the saucer. "The creditors were most accommodating once I explained my position as head of the family, and my intention to restore the property to its former glory." The information startled Beatrice from her polite detachment, though she maintained her outward composure. "That is welcome news, Lord Morland. I am pleased the house will remain in family hands rather than being sold to strangers." "Precisely my thinking, Beatrice," he replied, the use of her given name without permission marking the first overt indication that his visit carried intentions beyond mere family courtesy. "And that brings me to the primary purpose of my journey to Devonshire. It is time for you to return to London and resume your proper place in society, as my wife and the mistress of Tilney House." The declaration hung in the air between them as lightning flashed outside, illuminating Morland's features with harsh clarity that revealed the calculation beneath his practiced charm. Beatrice set down her own cup with steady hands that belied her inner turmoil at this unexpected proposition. "I believe you misunderstand my situation, Lord Morland. I have no intention of returning to London, nor of remarrying at present. My period of mourning has 2 months yet to run." "A mere formality," he dismissed with an impatient wave of his hand, particularly between family members. "You have already adopted half-mourning, I see, which many consider sufficient observance for a widow of your youth. Our marriage would preserve family connections and restore your position in society, advantages that surely outweigh adherence to outdated conventions of mourning." The rain intensified, lashing against the windows with growing fury that matched Beatrice's rising indignation at Morland's presumption, before she could formulate a response that balanced firmness with civility. He continued with increasing confidence, outlining his vision of their future together, as though her acceptance were a foregone conclusion. "The London house requires a hostess, and while your reduced circumstances here may hold rustic charm, surely you must miss the comforts and society of your proper sphere. As Lady Morland, you would regain everything you lost through my cousin's unfortunate financial mismanagement." Beatrice felt a familiar sensation creeping over her, the constriction of being viewed as an ornament rather than a person, a useful addition to a man's household rather than an individual with her own desires and ambitions. Yet unlike her reaction to similar situations during her marriage to Richard, when she had retreated into silent compliance, she now recognized the strength that her months of independence had cultivated. "Lord Morland, I must decline your offer," she stated clearly, rising from her seat to signal the conclusion of their conversation. "While I appreciate what you may consider generosity, I have discovered contentment in my present circumstances and have no desire to exchange them for a return to London society, regardless of the material advantages." Morland's expression hardened, the practiced charm giving way to irritation at this unexpected rejection. His gaze travelled deliberately around the cottage parlour, lingering on the visible signs of modest means, the darned curtains and simple furnishings that contrasted sharply with the luxury Beatrice had once taken for granted as Lady Tilney. "You misunderstand your position, my dear," he said, his tone now condescending rather than persuasive. "The cottage may provide temporary shelter, but your funds must be nearly exhausted after settling Richard's debts. Without a husband's protection, your situation will become increasingly precarious. I offer security and status that you cannot maintain alone." The storm outside reached its full intensity, rain hammering against the roof and windows as thunder crashed overhead, nature's fury providing dramatic accompaniment to the tension within the cottage. Beatrice stood her ground, her voice remaining steady despite the anger his assumptions provoked. "My financial affairs are not your concern, Lord Morland. I have resources sufficient to maintain my independence, and I find that independence far more valuable than the gilded cage you offer." Morland rose then, his height allowing him to look down at Beatrice with an expression that had abandoned all pretense of courtship in favour of cold calculation. "You have only 2 months of mourning left, Beatrice," he stated, closing the distance between them with deliberate steps. "You will need a husband, and there are few who would offer what I propose, given the circumstances of Richard's death and the scandal of his debts. Better to accept graciously now than to find yourself truly desperate when your funds are exhausted." Before Beatrice could respond to this thinly veiled threat, the cottage door burst open with a gust of wind and rain, admitting a tall figure in a drenched military greatcoat. Frederick Brandon stood in the doorway, water streaming from his hat and shoulders, his unexpected appearance momentarily stunning both occupants of the parlour into silence. A lightning flash illuminated his face, revealing an expression of barely controlled emotion as he took in the scene before him, Morland standing too close to Beatrice, her posture rigid with evident discomfort. "Colonel Brandon," Beatrice breathed, relief and something warmer flooding her voice as she moved instinctively toward him, away from Morland's looming presence. "I had not expected you until tomorrow." "The roads from Portsmouth were passable despite the weather," Frederick replied, his deep voice measured as he removed his dripping hat, though his eyes never left Morland's face. "I decided to press on rather than delay my arrival." His gaze shifted to Beatrice, softening momentarily as he assessed her condition before returning with increased intensity to Morland. "I believe I am interrupting," he added, the formal words belied by his stance that suggested no intention of withdrawal. "Lord Nathaniel Morland," Beatrice's visitor introduced himself with cold courtesy, clearly annoyed by the interruption, yet aware that Brandon's military rank and bearing commanded a certain respect. "I am Richard Tilney's cousin and the current head of the family." "Colonel Frederick Brandon," came the equally frigid response. "I served with Richard and have maintained a friendship with Lady Tilney during her bereavement." The atmosphere in the cottage parlour crackled with tension that matched the storm outside, each man taking the measure of the other with the instinctive recognition of rivals. Morland recovered his composure first, turning back to Beatrice with renewed determination. "We will continue our discussion another time, perhaps, when you have had opportunity to consider my proposal more carefully and without interruption." Beatrice straightened to her full height, the months of independence having replaced the compliant behaviour her marriage had instilled. "There is nothing further to consider, Lord Morland. My answer remains unchanged and will not alter with time or reflection. I have no interest in returning to London or in remarrying at present. I would appreciate if you would respect my decision without further importuning." Morland's face darkened with anger poorly disguised as concern. "You have only 2 months of mourning left, Beatrice. You will need a husband," he repeated, the statement now carrying an unmistakable note of warning rather than persuasion, his use of her given name deliberate and possessive. "Lady Tilney will marry when and whom she chooses," Frederick interjected, moving to stand beside Beatrice, not touching her, but positioning himself as a barrier between her and Morland. His tone remained controlled, but carried an undercurrent of authority that his military career had honed to perfection. "And I choose to wait until my heart and society both agree on the proper time," Beatrice added, her voice steady and her gaze direct as she faced Morland without flinching. "I suggest you return to London, Lord Morland. Devonshire weather can be treacherous for those unaccustomed to country travel, and the storm appears to be worsening." The dismissal, though politely phrased, was unmistakable. Morland looked from Beatrice to Frederick, comprehension dawning in his expression as he observed their united front, the unspoken connection between them evident despite their careful maintenance of proper distance. "So that is how matters stand," he said coldly, reaching for his hat and gloves with deliberate movements. "I wonder what society would make of the devoted widow finding consolation with her husband's friend well before the mourning period concludes." The threat hung in the air like the charged atmosphere before lightning strikes. Frederick took a half step forward, his hands clenching at his sides, but Beatrice placed her fingers lightly on his arm, a touch so brief it might have been imagined yet sufficient to restore his control. "Society has always thrived on baseless speculation, Lord Morland," she responded with dignity that belied the rapid beating of her heart. "Those who know me understand my adherence to propriety and would dismiss such insinuations as the product of disappointment rather than observation. Colonel Brandon has been a loyal friend to the Tilney family, and to me during my bereavement, nothing more and nothing less than honor would permit." Morland assessed them both for a long moment before offering a stiff bow that acknowledged defeat, if not acceptance. "I shall take my leave then. The family connection obligates me to extend my protection, Lady Tilney, should you reconsider your current path. Remember that provincial retreat, however charming, offers limited prospects for a woman accustomed to London society." The cottage door closed behind him with finality, leaving Beatrice and Frederick alone in the parlour as the storm continued to rage outside. For several heartbeats, they remained motionless, the tension of the confrontation still vibrating in the air between them, until Frederick broke the silence with quiet concern. "Are you well, Beatrice?" The use of her given name, the first time he had permitted himself this intimacy, acknowledged the shift in their relationship that Morland's intrusion had precipitated. She nodded, moving to the window to watch Morland's carriage depart down the rain-soaked lane before turning back to face Frederick, seeing him properly for the first time since his dramatic entrance. His uniform was soaked from his journey through the storm, his hair darkened by rain, yet to Beatrice he had never appeared more essential to her happiness than in this moment of shared understanding. "I am well, Frederick," she confirmed, her own use of his name equally significant, a small yet momentous abandonment of formality. "Though I confess Lord Morland's visit was unwelcome in every respect. You arrived at a most opportune moment. I regret that my early appearance caused him to make explicit threats that might otherwise have remained implied," Frederick responded, removing his wet greatcoat and hanging it near the fire at Beatrice's gesture. "He had no right to pressure you regarding your future, particularly using such tactics." Beatrice moved to the fireplace, adding another log to build the warmth against the chill that Morland's visit had left behind more effectively than the autumn storm. "His assumptions about my circumstances are inaccurate," she said with a small smile that contained genuine amusement despite the seriousness of the situation. "He believes me financially desperate, unaware that B. Fairfax has become quite successful in London artistic circles these past months." Frederick's expression lightened at this reference to her painting career, pride evident in his features as he observed the quiet confidence that had replaced the uncertainty he remembered from their first meetings after Richard's death. "I received Mr. Wilton's letter describing the successful exhibition of your landscapes," he said. "Your talent deserves recognition, though I confess I selfishly appreciate that your pseudonym has protected you from unwanted attention." The storm continued outside, but seemed to diminish in intensity as they settled into conversation, catching up on the weeks since their last exchange of letters. Martha brought fresh tea and built up the fire, exchanging knowing glances with Jenkins as they observed the careful distance their mistress and the colonel maintained, despite the obvious pleasure each took in the other's company. The confrontation with Morland had clarified what neither had previously acknowledged directly, the certainty that their feelings had progressed beyond friendship to something deeper that still required patience, but no longer harbored doubt about reciprocation. As evening approached and the storm gradually subsided to gentle rainfall, Frederick reluctantly prepared to depart for his rooms at the village inn, conscious of propriety despite the temptation to prolong his visit. At the cottage door he paused, searching for words that would acknowledge what had transpired without overstepping the boundaries they had respected for 10 months. 61 days remain, Beatrice, he said finally, the simple arithmetic expressing everything they had left unspoken through months of waiting. 61 days, she confirmed, meeting his gaze directly, her eyes conveying certainty rather than hesitation. And then I believe we may have much to discuss. Frederick nodded, the promise in her words sustaining him as he stepped back into the damp evening, the cleared sky revealing the first stars appearing above the Devonshire hills. The crisis had tested their resolve, and found it unshaken, each now certain of the other's heart, while still committed to honoring the path they had chosen, the careful progression through proper mourning toward a future they could finally acknowledge, waited for them both when the prescribed period of separation reached its conclusion. November returned to Devonshire like a familiar melody played in a minor key, bringing with it the 11th month of Beatrice's mourning period, and a bittersweet awareness that only 30 days remained before convention would release her from the final constraints of widowhood. The autumn colours that had blazed across the countryside during Frederick's October visit had now faded to subtler hues of amber and bronze, yet Beatrice's garden at Rosehill Cottage maintained surprising vitality due to her careful planning and tending throughout the preceding months. Late roses still clung to their stems alongside chrysanthemums in rich burgundy and gold, while the herbs and evergreens she had planted in the spring provided structure and fragrance that defied the season's gradual surrender to winter. Frederick had written to announce his arrival 3 days in advance, explaining that his regiment would be relocating to winter quarters near Plymouth in mid-November, necessitating a brief farewell visit before his duties would prevent further travel until the new year. Beatrice read this letter with complex emotions, disappointment at the prospect of separation during the final weeks of mourning, mingling with anticipation of seeing him once more before that separation. She spent the intervening days in careful preparation, directing Martha and Jenkins in thorough cleaning of the cottage, selecting the finest produce from her kitchen garden for meals, and completing a small painting of the view from her studio window that she intended as a gift for Frederick to carry with him to his new posting. The morning of his expected arrival dawned with unexpected warmth for November, the sun burning through early mist to create the kind of golden autumn day that seemed to suspend time between seasons. Beatrice chose her attire with particular care, selecting a walking dress in the deepest shade of lavender that half-mourning permitted, its simple lines complementing her figure without the elaborate trimmings that had characterized her wardrobe during her marriage. She had just finished arranging her hair in a style less severe than her usual morning coiffure when Martha announced that Colonel Brandon's horse had been spotted on the lane, approaching the cottage. Frederick arrived bearing gifts that reflected his understanding of her transformed interests, a set of fine paintbrushes carefully selected from a Portsmouth craftsman, and a leather-bound volume of poetry by Wordsworth that they had discussed in their correspondence. Their greeting in the cottage parlour maintained the proper formality that 11 months of careful patience had established as their pattern, yet both were acutely conscious of the calendar's significance, the proximity to the date when such restraint would no longer be necessary. They passed the early afternoon in conversation about his upcoming relocation and her latest artistic commissions, the mundane topics serving as safe territory while undercurrents of anticipation flowed beneath their words. As the November sun began its early descent toward the horizon, Frederick suggested a walk in the garden before his departure, his voice casual, though his eyes conveyed deeper meaning that Beatrice understood immediately. The garden path wound through sections that chronicled Beatrice's year at the cottage, from the established rose beds she had rejuvenated upon her arrival to the new plantings that represented her growing confidence and independence. Most significant was the southwestern corner, where she had created an entirely new garden after Richard's death, transforming bare earth into a harmonious arrangement of flowering plants, herbs, and small fruit trees that would mature in seasons to come. This section, visible from her studio window and tended with particular care throughout the changing seasons, symbolized her emergence from the shadows of her marriage into self-determined life. As they walked side by side along the gravel paths, their hands occasionally brushed with seemingly accidental contact that sent awareness coursing through them both, each touch a reminder of the diminishing barriers between them as the mourning period approached its conclusion. The setting sun bathed the garden in golden light that transformed the autumn landscape into a tableau of warmth and possibility, catching in Beatrice's dark hair and illuminating her features with a glow that Frederick found himself memorizing to sustain him through the coming separation. They paused beside a stone bench, positioned to catch the last rays of sunlight, its weathered surface warmed by the day's unexpected mildness. Though they had maintained conversation throughout their circuit of the garden, a meaningful silence fell between them as they stood contemplating the view across the valley, the distant hills hazed with the particular blue that characterized Devonshire evenings. "I must return to the regiment tomorrow morning," Frederick said finally, his deep voice carrying regret that extended beyond the simple statement of duty. "We will be engaged in training exercises until after Christmas, which means I shall not see Rose Hill Cottage again before your mourning period concludes." The directness of this reference to the calendar they had both been counting startled Beatrice, though she welcomed the acknowledgement of what had remained largely unspoken between them despite months of growing closeness. "I shall miss your visits," she replied with equal honesty, turning slightly to face him, the dying sunlight casting half her face in golden illumination while shadowing the other half. "They have brought meaning to days that might otherwise have passed in isolation." Frederick moved a half-step closer, close enough that she could detect the sandalwood scent that she had come to associate with his presence, a fragrance she had sometimes imagined she detected in the cottage for days after his departures. "Have counted each one as both privilege and torment," he admitted, his restraint finally yielding to greater candor as the sunset gilded the garden around them. "To be near you, yet bound by honor to maintain distance, has tested my resolve in ways no military campaign ever managed." The confession hung in the air between them, neither shocking nor unwelcome, but significant in its timing, with the prescribed period of mourning not yet complete. Beatrice felt her heart accelerate as Frederick's gaze held hers with an intensity that communicated far more than his carefully chosen words. "I believe we have both been counting the same days, Colonel Brandon," she responded, her use of his formal title gently reminding them both of the conventions they had agreed to honor, even as her tone conveyed understanding of the emotions beneath his statement. 30 more days now remain." Frederick smiled at her precise accounting, recognizing the echo of his own meticulous calendar. "Indeed, Lady Tilney," he confirmed, matching her retreat to formality, while his eyes maintained the connection that titles could not diminish. 30 days that stand between propriety and the freedom to speak what has lived in my thoughts these many months." The golden light intensified as the sun touched the distant hills, casting long shadows across the garden while bathing their faces in honeyed radiance that seemed to pause time in a perfect moment of anticipation and acknowledgement. Frederick's hand moved toward hers, their fingers nearly touching on the sun-warmed stone of the bench between them. "Beatrice, when your mourning ends," he began, his voice dropping to a register that sent awareness coursing through her like the first thaw of spring after the longest winter. The sentence remained unfinished as the sound of carriage wheels on the cottage lane shattered the private world they had created in the garden's golden light. Jenkins's voice called from the cottage door, announcing the arrival of a visitor with apologetic awareness of his unfortunate timing. Beatrice closed her eyes briefly, disappointment washing through her at the interrupted moment, before composing her features into a welcoming expression appropriate for receiving company. "Though I regret the interruption, we shall have opportunity to continue our conversation in December," she said softly to Frederick as they turned toward the cottage, the unfinished declaration hovering between them like a promise partially revealed. "Miss Charlotte Fairfax," Jenkins announced as they entered the parlor, and Beatrice's disappointment transformed immediately to pleasure at the sight of her childhood friend, a petite woman with lively blue eyes and an infectious smile who had written regularly throughout Beatrice's mourning period, but had been prevented from visiting by family obligations in Bath. Charlotte embraced Beatrice warmly, before turning curious eyes toward Frederick, who bowed with military precision, while Beatrice performed the introduction. "Colonel Brandon has been a steadfast friend throughout my bereavement, Charlotte," Beatrice explained, her tone carefully neutral despite the color that rose in her cheeks under her friend's perceptive gaze. "He served with Richard and has kindly checked on my welfare during his visits to Devonshire." Charlotte's quick intelligence assessed the situation with remarkable accuracy, noting the careful distance between them and the underlying tension that suggested far more than friendly concern. Her eyes moved from Beatrice's flushed face to Frederick's controlled expression, recognition dawning in her features, though she maintained social politeness. "How fortunate that Richard's friend has shown such dedications to his widow's well-being," she observed, her tone innocent, while her eyes conveyed understanding of the unspoken dynamics. "Colonel Brandon, I believe you must think Devonshire particularly attractive to visit so regularly when military duties permit." Frederick acknowledged her gentle probing with a slight smile that transformed his serious countenance. "Devonshire has indeed revealed charms I had not fully appreciated during previous visits to the county, Miss Fairfax. I find the landscape increasingly difficult to leave behind when duty calls me elsewhere." The double meaning in his response was not lost on either woman, though Charlotte merely nodded with apparent acceptance of his explanation. Conversation flowed easily among the three as Martha served evening tea, Charlotte sharing news from Bath society, while Frederick and Beatrice maintained careful propriety that nevertheless failed to disguise their awareness of each other. As twilight deepened outside the cottage windows, Frederick rose to take his leave, citing the early departure required to rejoin his regiment on schedule. Beatrice accompanied him to the door, while Charlotte tactfully remained in the parlor, allowing them a moment of private farewell. "I shall write when military duties permit," Frederick promised, standing on the threshold between cottage warmth and gathering darkness, his tall figure silhouetted against the deepening blue of the evening sky. "The 30 days will pass, Beatrice, and then perhaps we may finish conversations too long interrupted." She nodded, not trusting her voice as emotions threatened to overwhelm the composure she had maintained throughout Charlotte's arrival. The knowledge that their next meeting would occur after the conclusion of her mourning period, releasing them from the constraints that had governed their relationship for nearly a year, filled her with anticipation that made this parting particularly difficult to bear. "Safe journey, Frederick," she said finally, allowing herself the intimacy of his given name in this private moment. "I shall count each day." His hand closed briefly over hers, the touch warming her skin despite its brevity, before he stepped into the November evening and walked toward his waiting horse. Beatrice watched until he disappeared around the bend in the lane, her heart full of words unspoken, yet increasingly certain of their eventual expression. When she returned to the parlor, Charlotte was standing by the window, her perceptive gaze assessing Beatrice with affection and concern. "My dear Bee," she said gently, using the childhood nickname that had been abandoned during Beatrice's years in London society. "Why did you not tell me in your letters that your heart had found its true home?" The directness of the question, so characteristic of Charlotte's forthright nature, brought unexpected tears to Beatrice's eyes, not of sadness but of relief at being able to acknowledge feelings she had carefully contained in proper restraint for 11 months. "Because I scarcely admitted it to myself until recently," she confessed, sinking into a chair beside the fire that Jenkins had built against the evening chill. "And because there has been nothing to tell beyond friendship that honors the conventions of mourning." Charlotte joined her by the fireside, taking her hand with the easy affection that had characterized their relationship since childhood. "He looks at you as though you are the sun after endless rain," she observed, squeezing Beatrice's fingers gently. "And you watch him with the same expression I remember from when we were girls, and you would gaze at something you desperately wanted, but believed beyond your reach." Beatrice smiled at her friend's accurate assessment, the burden of maintaining appearances lifting in the presence of someone who had known her before she became first Lady Tilney and then the Widow Tilney, roles that had obscured her essential self. "We have weathered much darkness, but the light approaches," she acknowledged, allowing herself to speak aloud the hope that had sustained her through the final months of mourning. 30 more days remain before society permits what my heart has known for some time." Charlotte's visit extended through the following week, her presence filling Rosehill Cottage with laughter and conversation that distracted Beatrice from Frederick's absence and the slow passage of November days. They walked the countryside together, visited the village shops, and spent evenings by the fire discussing everything from Charlotte's suitors in Bath to Beatrice's growing success as the mysterious artist B. Fairfax. On her final evening at the cottage, as they shared a bottle of wine Jenkins had carefully preserved from better days at Tilney House, Charlotte raised her glass in a toast that caught Beatrice by surprise. "To December and new beginnings," she said, her blue eyes twinkling with mischief and affection. "May it bring you the happiness you deserve with a man who clearly adores you, once propriety releases you both from this admirable but clearly agonizing restraint." Beatrice touched her glass to Charlotte's, allowing herself to acknowledge openly the anticipation that had been building with each passing day. "To new beginnings," she agreed, the words carrying the weight of promise as November days continued their measured progression toward December and the conclusion of the longest year of waiting either she or Frederick had ever experienced. After Charlotte's departure, Beatrice channeled her restless energy into preparations for winter, supervising the preservation of garden produce, arranging for additional firewood, and completing several paintings for Mr. Wilton's Christmas exhibition in London. In the evenings, she often walked in the garden despite the increasing chill, following the paths where she and Frederick had strolled during his last visit, remembering his unfinished sentence and allowing herself, at last, to anticipate its completion when December finally released them from the calendar that had both separated and connected them throughout the long months of mourning. December arrived in Devonshire with crystalline skies and frost that transformed Beatrice's garden into a glittering landscape of suspended animation, nature's own reflection of the anticipation that filled Rosehill Cottage as the final month of mourning began its measured progression toward conclusion. The morning that marked the beginning of the 12th month since Richard's funeral dawned with unusual clarity, sunlight streaming through windows still partially obscured by the dark curtains that had been part of Beatrice's morning observance. Standing in her bedchamber as the new day illuminated the cottage with winter brilliance, she made an impulsive decision, calling Martha to help her remove the heavy black drapes that had muted the natural light for nearly a year. Together they worked through the small cottage, replacing somber fabrics with the cream-colored curtains that had hung there during Beatrice's childhood, allowing December sunshine to flood each room with unfiltered radiance that seemed to announce transformation more effectively than any calendar. The physical act of removing these visible symbols of grief provided unexpected emotional release, and Beatrice found herself laughing with genuine pleasure as sunlight revealed the true colors of her paintings, the rich patina of the old wooden furniture, and the subtle hues of winter flowers Martha had arranged in pottery vases throughout the cottage. "I believe Lady Tilney has returned to us at last," Jenkins observed with dignified approval when he entered the parlor to find it transformed by light, his formal reference to her title containing the affection of long service as he noted her brightened countenance. The elderly butler had served her parents before their deaths and remembered Beatrice as a girl, making his observation particularly meaningful as she navigated this transition between past obligations and future possibilities. The first letter from Frederick arrived on the 3rd day of December, the familiar handwriting causing her heart to quicken, despite the knowledge that it likely contained disappointing news, as his previous correspondence had mentioned potential military assignments that might delay his return to Devonshire. "My dearest Beatrice," he began, the formal address of earlier letters now abandoned in these final weeks of waiting. "I write with news that tests my belief in fate's kindness, having received orders to join a diplomatic mission to Brussels that departs immediately and will occupy me until precisely the 28th of this month. The irony that duty calls me away during these final weeks of waiting seems almost deliberately crafted to test my patience beyond endurance. However, I have secured absolute certainty from my commanding officer that I shall be released without exception on that date, allowing sufficient time to reach Devonshire by the anniversary we have both been counting toward with such determined attention. I will arrive at Rose Hill Cottage on the afternoon of November 15th, exactly 365 days since we stood together at Richard's graveside. Nothing short of catastrophe will prevent my keeping this promise, though I confess these additional weeks of separation feel more difficult to bear than the 11 months preceding them. I have lived a lifetime in this year of waiting, measuring days that transformed not only our circumstances, but perhaps ourselves as well. The man who will stand before you when mourning concludes is not identical to the one who watched you enter that first carriage of widowhood, though his heart remains unchanged in its essential direction. Until November 15th, I remain yours in patience that grows daily more challenging to maintain, Frederick. Beatrice read the letter multiple times before composing her reply. Disappointment at the extended separation, balanced by the certainty of his eventual arrival on the precise day that would mark the completion of her mourning period. His reference to their mutual transformation resonated deeply with her own reflections on the year that had reshaped her identity from dependent wife to independent woman, from Lady Tilney defined by her husband's position to Beatrice who had discovered capabilities and strengths previously untested. Her response, written by lamplight as December darkness fell early outside her windows, matched his candor while maintaining the restraint that had characterized their correspondence throughout the year. "My dear Frederick," she wrote, carefully selecting a sheet of cream-colored stationery rather than the black-bordered paper that had marked her earlier letters. "While I cannot pretend that news of your diplomatic assignment brings joy, I find myself grateful for the certainty of your return on the day that concludes this long vigil we have maintained with such careful patience. The cottage seems transformed since I removed the mourning drapes that have shadowed its windows since my arrival, sunlight now reaching corners long left in darkness, revealing colors and textures previously muted by grief's symbolic trappings. Perhaps this physical change reflects inner transitions as well, as the woman who returns to full participation in life differs significantly from the one who retreated to Devonshire in reduced circumstances 11 months ago. Some journeys are measured not in distance but in transformation, and I believe we have both traveled far while remaining outwardly in place, our paths running parallel toward a destination that grows clearer with each passing day. Until November 15th brings conclusion to this calendar we have followed with such dedication, I remain yours in anticipation that makes each day simultaneously endless and fleeting, Beatrice." With Frederick engaged in diplomatic matters that prevented frequent correspondence, Beatrice channeled her restless energy into practical preparations for the future that awaited beyond mourning's conclusion. She invited the village seamstress to the cottage, providing carefully preserved fabric from her mother's trunks to create a small wardrobe of colored garments that could replace her half-mourning attire when the anniversary date finally arrived. Together they designed dresses in deep blue that matched her eyes, forest green that complemented her dark hair, and warm burgundy that brought color to complexion too long concealed behind widow's weeds. Each garment featured simpler lines than London fashion dictated, reflecting Beatrice's transformed preferences for comfort and practicality over display, yet incorporating elegant details that honored her innate sense of beauty and proportion. Between fittings for her new wardrobe, Beatrice completed the series of landscapes commissioned by Mr. Wilton for his Christmas exhibition, including a winter scene of Rosehill Cottage that captured the special quality of December light she had rediscovered upon removing the mourning drapes. The London gallery owner's letter confirming receipt of these paintings brought news that transformed her artistic endeavors from pleasant occupation to significant achievement, as he reported that a collector had offered a substantial sum for the entire series, sufficient to ensure her financial independence regardless of future circumstances. Though I realize Lady Tilney's situation makes such considerations secondary, Wilton wrote, apparently unaware that she was the artist behind the bee. Fairfax' pseudonym, I believe she would be gratified to know that her protégé's work now commands prices that establish her among the most promising landscape artists currently exhibiting in London. The knowledge that her own talents had secured her future brought Beatrice profound satisfaction that extended beyond monetary considerations. The validation of abilities discovered during widowhood, confirming that Richard's death, while painful in many respects, had ultimately released her into a life of greater authenticity and fulfillment than her marriage had permitted. As mid-December approached, bringing the halfway point of the final month of mourning, Beatrice began receiving invitations to holiday gatherings from neighboring families, evidence that local society recognized her transition toward the conclusion of formal grieving. She declined most politely, explaining that she preferred to maintain proper observance until the full year had elapsed, though she accepted Charlotte Fairfax's invitation to join her family for Christmas dinner, a modest compromise that acknowledged both traditional requirements and her growing readiness to rejoin community life. The Fairfax household welcomed her with warmth that contrasted sharply with the calculated social interactions she had known in London, Charlotte's parents treating her not as an object of curiosity or pity, but as the daughter of old friends returned to her rightful place in county society. Throughout the Christmas celebration, Beatrice found herself observing family interactions with new awareness, noting the genuine affection between Charlotte's parents after 30 years of marriage, so different from the formal relationship she had witnessed between her own mother and father or experienced with Richard. This glimpse of partnership based on mutual respect and tenderness reinforced her growing certainty about the path that awaited when Frederick returned, the possibility of connection founded on genuine understanding rather than social convention or financial arrangement. As December days continued their inexorable progression toward the anniversary date, Beatrice received a brief note from Frederick confirming the successful conclusion of his diplomatic mission and his imminent departure for Devonshire, the paper bearing evidence of hasty composition, yet conveying certainty that their long separation would end precisely as planned. She read this confirmation with emotions too complex for simple categorization, anticipation mingled with fleeting apprehension as the abstract future they had discussed in veiled terms throughout the year suddenly transformed into imminent reality. 362 days had passed since Richard's funeral, each marked by gradual evolution in her understanding of herself and her desires. Yet the approaching culmination of this carefully observed mourning period brought questions that had remained unexamined during the waiting. Would Frederick find her changed too significantly from the woman he had first shown interest in, her independence and artistic pursuits altering her beyond his expectations? Had their separate journeys through the year of waiting led them toward the same destination? Or had physical distance allowed them to create idealized versions of each other that reality might not sustain? These questions surfaced particularly during night hours, when December darkness pressed against cottage windows, and imagination filled silence with both possibilities and doubts. Daylight invariably restored Beatrice's confidence, especially as she moved through the cottage that now reflected her true personality rather than conventional expectations of widowhood. The small parlor had been rearranged to accommodate her painting supplies, books selected for personal interest rather than social appearance, lined shelves that once held decorative objects of little meaning, and fresh flowers brightened rooms regardless of seasonal limitations, defying winter's austerity with color and fragrance that symbolized her refusal to conceal life beneath morning's restrictions any longer. The final days of December passed with excruciating slowness, each sunrise bringing Beatrice one day closer to the anniversary that would mark her formal release from widowhood's constraints, each sunset concluding another 24 hours of waiting that seemed simultaneously interminable and fleeting. She found herself checking the cottage clock with unprecedented frequency, calculating hours remaining with the same attention to detail that had characterized her counting of months and weeks throughout the preceding year. Martha observed her mistress's restlessness with knowing eyes, having witnessed Beatrice's transformation from grieving widow to independent woman with quiet approval that occasionally manifested in practical assistance beyond her official duties. On the morning of the 364th day, the lady's maid appeared with a small package carefully wrapped in brown paper, presenting it to Beatrice with uncharacteristic shyness. "I took the liberty, my lady," she explained, as Beatrice unwrapped the parcel to reveal a bottle of lavender water, the scent Beatrice had favored before marriage, but abandoned during her years with Richard, who had preferred his wife to use more fashionable French perfumes. "I remembered it was your favorite as a girl," Martha continued, her usually composed features showing traces of uncertainty at this personal gesture, "and thought perhaps you might wish to reclaim it, now that tomorrow brings the end of mourning." The thoughtfulness of this simple gift moved Beatrice deeply, evidence that those closest to her recognized the significance of returning to her authentic self, rather than merely exchanging widow's weeds for colored garments. She impulsively embraced Martha, conventional boundaries between mistress and servant momentarily set aside in genuine gratitude. "Thank you for remembering who I was before I became Lady Tilney," she said softly, uncorking the bottle to breathe in the familiar scent that evoked memories of her mother's garden and girlhood freedom. "It seems appropriate to reclaim this along with other aspects of myself that were set aside during marriage." The final night of mourning, the 364th since Richard's funeral, brought unexpected snowfall that transformed the Devonshire landscape into pristine whiteness, nature providing dramatic setting for the conclusion of Beatrice's year of patience. She stood at her bedchamber, window watching moonlight illuminate the snow-covered garden, each familiar feature rendered new by the crystalline blanket that concealed autumn's fading remnants beneath promise of renewal. The symbolism seemed fitting culmination to months of gradual transformation, the abrupt visual change reflecting inner transitions that had occurred with less visible but equally profound effect throughout the preceding year. Across Devonshire, in quarters secured at the coaching inn, where his journey from London had concluded after nightfall, made continuing to Rose Hill Cottage impractical, Frederick Brandon prepared methodically for the following day's significance. He had arrived in the county one day early deliberately, unwilling to risk weather or travel delays interfering with his promise to reach Beatrice exactly 365 days after they had stood together at Richard's graveside. His military trunk contained civilian clothing chosen with unprecedented attention to appearance, practical items selected for the cottage visit, and most significantly, a small velvet box that held his mother's sapphire ring, preserved through campaigns across Europe, and now destined for purpose that would have delighted the gentlewoman who had worn it for 30 years of happy marriage. On the small desk provided by the inn, Frederick's calendar lay open to the final page of December, each preceding day meticulously crossed through with precise lines that documented his faithful counting throughout the year of separation. The 15th of November had been circled in red ink months earlier, the date standing out from surrounding numbers with significance that transcended mere chronology, representing not just time's passage, but honor's fulfillment and patience's reward. As he prepared for sleep that would bring morning, and with it the conclusion of their waiting, Frederick reviewed mental maps of the route to Rose Hill Cottage, calculating travel time with characteristic thoroughness, determined that his arrival would occur precisely when expected, neither early enough to suggest improper eagerness, nor late enough to cause concern. Every detail had been anticipated and addressed with military precision, the planning providing structure for emotions too powerful to examine directly on this final night of separation. The year that had begun in grief and restraint would conclude in possibility and freedom, 365 days of honorable waiting transformed from burden to achievement, as the calendar completed its full cycle from funeral to future. Morning would bring snow-brightened clarity to landscapes too long viewed through morning's filters, and with that illumination, the opportunity to speak words that had lived in heart and mind throughout months of correspondence and careful visits, patience finally yielding to the honest expression of feelings that had grown stronger rather than diminished during their year of waiting. The 15th of November dawned over Devonshire with crystalline brilliance, sunlight transforming the overnight snowfall into a glittering landscape that crunched beneath carriage wheels as Frederick Brandon travelled the final miles toward Rose Hill Cottage. 365 days had passed since Richard Tilney's funeral, each one meticulously counted, each one bringing incremental change to the lives of two people bound by honor to wait despite growing certainty about their feelings for one another. Frederick sat straight-backed in the hired carriage, watching familiar landmarks emerge from the winter scenery, his military posture betraying nothing of the anticipation that quickened his pulse with each passing mile. He had awakened before dawn, unable to remain abed, as the significance of the date filled him with restless energy that demanded movement after months of patient stillness. Now, as midday approached and the cottage lane appeared ahead, he found himself adjusting his civilian attire with uncharacteristic attention, smoothing the dark blue coat that Charlotte Fairfax had casually mentioned was Beatrice's favourite colour during their brief acquaintance in October. The small velvet box containing his mother's sapphire ring rested securely in his waistcoat pocket, its weight against his chest a tangible reminder of intentions he had harboured silently throughout the long year of waiting. Inside Rose Hill Cottage, Beatrice moved through morning routines with deliberate calmness that belied her inner turmoil of anticipation and fleeting uncertainty. Martha had helped her dress with particular care, exchanging the lavender gown of half-mourning for a dress of deep blue that marked her first true colour since Richard's death, its rich hue complementing her eyes and dark hair, while its simple elegance reflected her transformed preferences. The cottage itself seemed to share her anticipation, sunlight streaming through windows no longer draped in black, fresh flowers arranged in every room despite winter's limitations, fires burning cheerfully in grates that Martha and Jenkins maintained with careful attention throughout the morning. As the mantel clock chimed 12, Beatrice paused at the parlour window that overlooked the cottage lane, her composed exterior masking the rapid beating of her heart as she contemplated the significance of this day that concluded 365 days of proper mourning, of patience and gradual transformation, of letters exchanged and feelings acknowledged yet never fully expressed. So much had changed since that grey November day in London, when Richard Tilney had been lowered into the earth, while society watched her performance of widowhood with critical eyes. The woman who now stood in a blue dress awaiting Frederick's arrival bore little resemblance to the Lady Tilney, who had maintained perfect composure at her husband's graveside, her internal numbness concealed beneath widow's weeds and appropriate expressions of grief. The sound of carriage wheels on the snow-covered lane drew her attention from reflection to present reality, and Beatrice moved to the small mirror in the entry hall, making a final adjustment to her hair before taking a deep breath to steady herself for the meeting that would transform patient waiting into new beginning. Jenkins opened the cottage door as the carriage halted at the garden gate, his dignity momentarily softening into something approaching satisfaction as Colonel Brandon emerged, tall and imposing even in civilian clothing, his military bearing evident in his straight posture and purposeful stride as he approached the cottage entrance. "Colonel Brandon, my lady," Jenkins announced with formal precision that contained subtle approval, stepping aside to allow Frederick entry into the cottage that had been the setting for so many carefully restrained interactions throughout the preceding year. Beatrice stood in the parlor doorway, the blue of her dress catching the winter sunlight that streamed through uncovered windows, her dark hair arranged simply without the severe styling that mourning had dictated, her face illuminated with quiet joy that required no words to communicate. Frederick halted momentarily upon seeing her, the transformation from widow in mourning to woman in full color seeming to render him speechless despite months of anticipation for precisely this moment. "Lady Tilney," he said finally, his deep voice containing reverence that transcended the formal address they had maintained throughout their long acquaintance. "Beatrice," he corrected himself immediately, the use of her given name without hesitation marking the first acknowledgement that this day had fundamentally altered what propriety permitted between them. "Frederick," she replied, the single word carrying warmth that conveyed welcome beyond conventional greeting as she extended her hand toward him, no longer gloved in black, but bare in the final symbol of mourning's conclusion. He crossed the entryway in 3 strides, taking her offered hand in both of his, the contact no longer limited to brief handshakes or accidental touches during garden walks, but deliberate connection that neither felt compelled to end quickly. "I have counted every day, every hour," Frederick said simply, his voice lowered for her ears alone, though Jenkins had tactfully retreated to the kitchen, leaving them in the privacy that their new circumstances finally permitted. "And I have spent each one becoming the woman worthy of your weight," Beatrice responded, the honesty of her words reflecting the journey of self-discovery that widowhood had unexpectedly facilitated, the gradual emergence of strength and independence that had transformed her during months of solitude and reflection. They stood together in the cottage entryway, hands still joined, the silence between them comfortable rather than awkward as they absorbed the reality of finally being together, without the constraints that had governed their interactions for precisely 365 days. "The blue dress," Frederick observed with a smile that transformed his serious features, "suits you far better than mourning ever did." "Martha helped me select the fabric months ago," Beatrice admitted, returning his smile with one of her own that reached her eyes in a way Richard had never witnessed during their marriage. "I confess I have anticipated wearing color again, with perhaps unseemly eagerness for a widow meant to be consumed by grief." She led him into the parlor where Jenkins had arranged refreshments before discreetly withdrawing. The familiar room transformed not only by sunlight streaming through uncovered windows, but by Beatrice's personal touches that had gradually replaced the generic decorations of a rental property with objects of genuine meaning. A painting of the cottage garden in summer hung above the mantelpiece, one of her earliest works signed with the B. Fairfax that had become known in London artistic circles, while books of poetry and natural history lined shelves once reserved for decorative items selected primarily for appearance rather than significance. "Would you care to walk in the garden?" Frederick asked after they had exchanged news of the intervening weeks since his October visit, his suggestion reflecting their established pattern of finding greater ease in conversation while moving through the outdoor spaces Beatrice had cultivated throughout her year at Rosehill Cottage, "though winter has transformed it considerably since your last visit." She agreed, rising to collect a wool shawl that complemented her blue dress, the practical accessory replacing the heavy black wraps of mourning with something that provided warmth without symbolic burden. They stepped from cottage warmth into crystalline winter afternoon, their breath forming visible clouds in the cold air as they followed paths now outlined by snow rather than gravel. The garden structure revealed in stark relief by winter's simplification of its features. Though most plants lay dormant beneath snow covering, the evergreen sections Beatrice had planted in spring provided structure and subtle color that defied the season's barrenness, promising continuity and eventual renewal when spring returned to Devonshire. The silence between them as they walked contained none of the careful restraint that had characterized previous garden strolls, the tension of unspoken feelings replaced by comfortable awareness that words could now follow their natural course rather than being constrained by propriety's limitations. They paused beside the stone bench that had witnessed their near confession in October, snow covering its surface making sitting impractical, yet drawing them to the location that held particular significance in their shared history. Frederick turned to face Beatrice directly, winter sunlight illuminating his features with clarity that revealed both certainty and momentary vulnerability, as he prepared to speak words long reserved for precisely this day. "I have rehearsed this moment in my mind throughout 365 days of waiting," he began, his deep voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes as they held hers without wavering. "Yet now that propriety finally permits me to speak freely, I find myself questioning whether words can adequately express what has grown in my heart during our year of patience." Beatrice looked up at him, snow-reflected light brightening her features as she waited for him to continue, her own expression conveying understanding of the challenge in translating feelings maintained in silence into language that honored their depth without diminishing them through inadequate expression. "I loved you in silence long before Richard's death," Frederick continued, the confession offered without apology yet with awareness of its complexity, not with any dishonorable intention or action, but with growing recognition that my friend had been blessed with a treasure he failed to properly value. "When circumstances made you a widow, honor demanded patience that love would have gladly abandoned, yet that very waiting has transformed what might have been mere attraction into something far deeper and more enduring." He paused, reaching into his waistcoat pocket to withdraw the small velvet box that had accompanied him from London, its weight familiar against his palm as he held it without immediately opening it, completing his declaration before presenting its tangible symbol. "I stand before you now, Beatrice, not as your husband's friend bound by obligation to ensure your welfare, nor as a man seeking convenient arrangement with a widow of suitable background, but as someone who has come to know your strength, your talents, your capacity for joy and independence, and wishes nothing more than partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection." The simple eloquence of his words touched Beatrice deeply, their honesty reflecting the authentic connection that had developed through letters and visits throughout her year of mourning, the gradual revelation of true character that conventional courtship rarely permitted. "Before I respond, I must ensure complete honesty between us," she said, her voice steady as she made the confession she had never spoken aloud to anyone, not even Charlotte, during her most candid correspondence. "I did not love Richard as a wife should love her husband, nor did he love me as anything beyond a suitable match that brought financial advantage and social connection. Our marriage existed in appearance rather than substance, a proper arrangement rather than true partnership. My mourning began as obligation rather than genuine grief, though I felt regret for a life cut short before its owner found real purpose or happiness." Frederick nodded, neither shocked nor judgmental at this admission that might have scandalized society, but merely confirmed what he had suspected from observations during Richard's lifetime and Beatrice's composed reaction to his death. His features softened with understanding as she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. The year of mourning that convention demanded has given me unexpected gifts beyond proper observance of tradition. I discovered myself beneath the layers of expectation that marriage had imposed, found talents and strength I never knew existed while Richard lived, and most significantly, recognized the difference between arrangement and attachment, between suitable match and genuine love. She stepped closer to him, snow crunching beneath her boots as she eliminated the careful distance they had maintained throughout months of propriety, close enough now that she could detect the familiar scent of sandalwood that had always accompanied him, that she had sometimes imagined lingering in the cottage long after his departures. The woman who stands before you today in blue rather than black bears little resemblance to the Lady Tilney who entered widowhood exactly 1 year ago, she said softly. She has opinions she expresses without apology, talents she pursues with dedication, and a heart that has learned to recognize worth beyond title or fortune. Frederick opened the velvet box then, revealing the sapphire ring nestled against dark fabric, its deep blue stone surrounded by small diamonds that caught winter sunlight in prismatic display. This belonged to my mother, who received it from my father not as symbol of ownership, but as token of partnership that lasted 30 years until her death, he explained, holding it between them as snowflakes began to fall gently around them, nature providing delicate accompaniment to the moment they had anticipated throughout months of waiting. I offer it now with similar intention, as acknowledgement that true marriage exists in mutual respect and genuine affection rather than social convenience or traditional arrangement. His voice deepened with emotion as he asked the question that had lived in his heart since standing beside her at Richard's funeral exactly 365 days earlier. Beatrice Tilney, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, not because convention expects remarriage or circumstances demand protection, but because two people who have come to know each other through patience and honesty choose partnership over solitude? Snow continued to fall around them as Beatrice looked from the ring to Frederick's face, her eyes bright with emotions too complex for simple categorization, yet unmistakably joyful as she gave the answer that completed their year-long journey from restraint to honesty. I began mourning a marriage that never truly existed, and end it by celebrating one that already lives in our hearts, she replied, the words carrying certainty that left no doubt about her feelings or her choice. Yes, Frederick Brandon, I will marry you, not from necessity or convenience, but from love that has grown stronger through waiting and knowing. He slipped the sapphire ring onto her finger, where it settled as though designed for her hand, the deep blue stone complementing both her dress and her eyes as she looked up at him with undisguised happiness. The careful distance they had maintained throughout months of visits and correspondence dissolved as Frederick drew her gently into his arms, their first embrace occurring exactly 365 days after they had stood side by side at Richard's funeral, propriety finally yielding to the genuine connection that had developed through patience and gradual revelation. Their first kiss, shared in a garden transformed by snow, yet promising renewal beneath winter's temporary covering, contained both the sweetness of long-anticipated fulfillment and the depth of understanding that their year of waiting had cultivated. Neither hasty passion nor calculated arrangement, but genuine recognition of partnership worth the patience required to honor convention while discovering true compatibility. As afternoon light began its early winter decline toward sunset, they returned to the cottage hand in hand, no longer concerned with maintaining proper distance or limiting physical contact to brief, formal touches. Martha had lit lamps throughout the small rooms, their golden glow creating welcome against the gathering darkness outside. While Jenkins had built up fires in both parlor and dining room, the cottage offering warmth that reflected the emotional transformation occurring within its walls as mourning officially concluded and new beginning emerged from patient waiting. I have taken a house near Plymouth, Frederick explained as they sat before the parlor fire, his military duties requiring proximity to the naval base while permitting establishment of more permanent residence than his years of active campaigning had allowed. It offers gardens you might enjoy cultivating and rooms with northern light suitable for painting, should you wish to continue your artistic endeavors as Mrs. Brandon." Beatrice smiled at his consideration of her newfound passions, the assumption that marriage would enhance rather than constrain her independence and interests so different from her experience with Richard, who had viewed her preferences as inconveniences to be tolerated rather than essential aspects of her character to be supported. "Mr. Wilton has requested additional landscapes for his spring exhibition," she replied, the sapphire ring catching firelight as she gestured toward canvases stacked in the corner of the parlour awaiting shipment to London. Perhaps B. Fairfax might eventually acknowledge her true identity, though I confess I have enjoyed the freedom of creating without society's expectations colouring reception of my work. The conversation flowed easily between them as winter darkness fell outside cottage windows, plans for their shared future emerging naturally from individual paths that had developed throughout the year of separation, yet always oriented toward eventual convergence. Jenkins served dinner in the small dining room, the meal simple but carefully prepared under Martha's supervision to mark the significance of this day that concluded Beatrice's mourning and began her journey toward new identity as Frederick's wife, partnership based on genuine knowing rather than convenient arrangement. As they lingered over dessert, Frederick reached across the table to take Beatrice's hand, the sapphire ring glinting in candlelight as their fingers intertwined without concern for propriety or observation, the privacy of the cottage permitting expressions of affection that London society would have judged premature even after full mourning's conclusion. "When Charlotte Fairfax visits next week, she will be insufferably pleased with herself for predicting this outcome," Beatrice observed with affectionate exasperation, her friend's perceptive assessment of their feelings during her October visit having proved entirely accurate despite their careful maintenance of proper behavior in her presence. "She told me quite directly that we looked at each other as though the other contained all the light missing from the world, and suggested I might consider concluding mourning a few weeks early given the obvious direction of my affections." Frederick laughed, the sound of genuine amusement filling the cottage dining room, and revealing another aspect of himself that military discipline and social constraint had rarely permitted him to display during their previous interactions. "I found Miss Fairfax alarmingly perceptive after barely an hour in her company," he admitted, raising Beatrice's hand to his lips in the gesture of affection that would have scandalized society during her mourning, but now seemed natural expression of feelings no longer requiring concealment. "She informed me quite directly while you were speaking with Jenkins that she expected to attend our wedding before the season changed, and would accept no excuses about proper intervals between mourning and remarriage, given what she termed our obvious attachment." As the evening progressed toward its inevitable conclusion, neither seemed inclined to acknowledge the approaching separation that nightfall would require, Frederick's proper return to the village inn conflicting with their mutual desire to extend these first hours of openly acknowledged feelings. The cottage clock chimed 9, its sound breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them as they sat before the parlour fire, hands still joined as though reluctant to relinquish the connection long denied by propriety's demands. "I should return to the inn," Frederick said finally, duty and honour reasserting themselves despite changed circumstances that made such separation increasingly difficult to accept. "We have observed convention precisely for 365 days. It would be unfortunate to undermine that achievement in its final hours." Beatrice nodded, understanding the principles that guided him, even as she recognized the changing nature of propriety now that full mourning had concluded and their engagement had been established. "The village will still expect certain appearances," she acknowledged, rising from her chair with reluctance that matched his own, their hands remaining joined as they moved toward the cottage entrance, where Jenkins had already anticipated their needs by bringing Frederick's coat and hat. "We have waited this long with patience. I suppose we can manage the brief interval until banns are read and arrangements completed." The official engagement, they had agreed during evening discussions, would be announced immediately, rather than observing the customary period between mourning's conclusion and public acknowledgement of attachment, their year of waiting having provided more than adequate time for certainty about their compatibility and intentions. At the cottage door, Frederick drew Beatrice into his arms once more, their embrace containing both the joy of newfound freedom to express affection and the reluctance of impending separation, temporary though both knew it would be. "I shall return tomorrow morning," he promised, his voice deepened with emotions that transcended simple happiness to encompass gratitude for patience rewarded and honor maintained throughout their careful progression from friendship to love. 365 days of waiting have earned us the right to proceed, without further delay, toward the future we both desire. Beatrice reached up to touch his face, the gesture containing tenderness that required no words to communicate, as the sapphire ring caught lamplight in blue brilliance that symbolized transformation complete, mourning concluded, and new beginning established on foundation of mutual respect and genuine attachment. "Until tomorrow, then," she replied, her smile conveying certainty that extended beyond their immediate plans to lifetime of partnership, based not on convenience or arrangement, but on choice made with full knowledge of each other's true character, revealed through letters, conversations, and patient waiting that had transformed initial attraction into enduring love. As Frederick departed into November darkness, Beatrice stood in the cottage doorway watching until his figure disappeared down the lane toward the village, snow falling gently around her as she contemplated the journey that had brought her from Richard's funeral exactly 365 days earlier to this moment of completion and new beginning. The year of mourning, observed with proper patience despite growing awareness of feelings that transcended friendship, had provided unexpected gifts beyond conventional observance of tradition, allowing her to discover herself beyond the limitations of her first marriage and to recognize authentic connection when it finally appeared in her life. She closed the cottage door against winter chill, turning back to rooms now filled with evidence of both her independence and their shared future. The blue dress she wore, symbolizing not just mourning's conclusion, but the colors of possibility that would replace widow's black in the life she and Frederick would build together, equal partners rather than convenient arrangement. Their patience through 365 days of waiting, rewarded with the certainty that true marriage existed not in social convention, but in hearts that recognized each other's worth beyond title, fortune, or external expectation.